20 years ago, a starving boy begged a village girl for food. Everyone turned him away. Everyone except Vera. She gave him the last piece of bread she had and wrapped his wounded hand with a strip of her own shawl. She thought she would never see him again. She was wrong, because 20 years later, that starving boy returned, not as a beggar, but as the most feared Alpha King in the northern lands. And the moment his eyes found the small mark on Vera's hand, he knew. He had finally found her. Welcome back to Rena Romance 2, where every story begins with a single act of kindness and ends with a love that outlasts kingdoms. If you're new here, this is the place for slow-burn werewolf romance. Alphas who rule with iron and fall with their whole hearts, and the women brave enough to catch them. Settle in, because tonight's story is one of our most emotional yet. If it moves you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's begin. The winter of that year had nearly killed the village. Snow buried the roads. The river froze so solid that men walked across it without fear. Food had become more precious than gold, and doors that once opened to travelers now stayed shut, bolted against strangers who might beg for a meal they couldn't spare. One evening, at the edge of the forest where the tree line met the frozen fields, a young girl named Vera found a boy collapsed in the snow. He was thin as a reed, his lips cracked, his hands blue with cold. He could not have been older than 12. Blood had dried along one wrist, dark against pale skin, as though something had clawed him and he had run before it could finish. "Please," he whispered, when she knelt beside him. "Just a little food." Vera had one heel of bread left in her satchel, wrapped in cloth, saved for her own supper. She looked at the boy's hollow cheeks, and she did not hesitate. She broke the bread in half and pressed the larger piece into his hands. He ate like something wild, like something that had forgotten food was a thing that came without violence attached to it. When he was finished, she took the torn edge of her shawl and bound the wound on his wrist, gentle even though her own fingers had gone numb from the cold. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her a beat too long, as if deciding whether the question was safe to answer. "Kale," he finally said. Before she could ask anything more, where his family was, why he was alone, what had hunted him through the trees, a sound rolled through the forest. Low, guttural. Not quite a howl and not quite a growl, but something that made every hair on Vera's arms rise at once. The boy went rigid. "I have to go." "Wait." He was already backing toward the tree line, favoring the wounded arm she'd just bound. At the last moment, he turned back, and there was something in his eyes far older than his face. "I'll find you again," he said. "I promise." Then he vanished into the dark between the trees, and Vera stood alone in the snow, believing she had just witnessed a child's desperate, meaningless vow, the kind made by the frightened and the starving, spoken and then forgotten by morning. She did not know that the boy belonged to one of the most powerful werewolf packs in the Northern Territories. She did not know that rival wolves had been hunting him through the forest that very night, seeking to end a bloodline before it could grow into a threat. And she certainly did not know that the frightened, starving child she had fed with her own supper would one day become the Alpha King, a name spoken with equal parts reverence and terror across every pack from the coast to the mountains. 20 years passed. Vera grew from a girl with a soft heart into a woman with a guarded one. She lived now on the northern edge of the territories, in a settlement built into the shoulder of the mountains, where her family had kept land for 3 generations. She was known in the village for her steadiness, for the way she could set a broken bone, negotiate a fair trade, or stare down a drunken trapper twice her size without so much as raising her voice. She was not known for warmth. She had learned, somewhere in those 20 years, that warmth was a debt collected by those who least deserved it. Then, on a gray winter morning when frost still clung to the shutters, the warriors of the Black Wolf Pack came riding into the settlement. Word had reached the village 3 days earlier that the Alpha King himself was touring the northern borders, and every household had spent those 3 days in a low simmer of dread. Nobody summoned the Alpha King unless there was war, or unless he chose to come himself. And the second reason was worse than the first, because it meant he wanted something. The whole village gathered at the sound of hooves on the frozen road. When the column came into view, a dozen warriors in dark leather and fur, and at their head, A man who rode as though the horse existed only to carry him somewhere more important. Every head in the crowd bowed low. Vera did not bow. She stood at the front of the gathered villagers with her chin level and her eyes fixed on the man dismounting from the lead horse, and something in her, something old and stubborn, refused to lower her head to a stranger simply because he commanded fear. He noticed her instantly. Of course he did. In a sea of bowed heads, one uncovered face stands out like a lit torch in a dark room. Kale, for it was Kale, though Vera had no way of knowing that yet, crossed the frozen ground toward her with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a man who had never once needed to rush. He was not what she expected. She had built a picture in her mind of the Alpha King from rumor alone, brutal, scarred, cold as the mountain wind. What stood before her instead was a man carved from restraint, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with eyes the pale gray of a wolf caught between forms, and a stillness to him that felt less like calm and more like a held breath. "You don't kneel," he said. It was not quite a question. "I kneel for no one who hasn't earned it," Vera answered, and heard the murmur of alarm ripple through the crowd behind her. Something flickered across his face, not anger as she expected, but something closer to surprise, and beneath the surprise, an interest he did not bother to hide. It was then that Vera lifted her hand, unconsciously tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The same small, thoughtless gesture she had made 1,000 times, without meaning anything by it. Kale's gaze dropped to her hand, and stopped. There, faint with age but unmistakable, was a thin, pale scar in the shape of a crescent, the mark left by an old wound, wrapped once by a girl who had given a starving boy the last of her bread. The Alpha King went very still. His wolf, silent for 20 years beneath the armor of duty and command, surged against its cage with a single word that echoed through every part of him: mate. And for the first time in 2 decades, Kale understood that the promise he had made in a frozen forest as a dying child had not been forgotten. It had simply been waiting. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what happened first. The winter that made Kale, long before he became a king. He had been the youngest son of a pack alpha in the far north, a bloodline old enough that other packs feared what it might become if left to grow unchecked. When his father was killed in a border dispute, rival wolves moved quickly to finish what the dispute had started, hunting down every remaining member of the bloodline before they could reach adulthood and claim the territory back. Kale had been 8 years old when he began running. By the time he stumbled into the fields outside Vera's village, he had been running for 4 years, surviving on what the forest gave him and what he could steal from travelers too slow to stop him. He did not remember, later, exactly what had driven him to the village that night instead of past it. Hunger, certainly. But something else too. Some instinct that told him this particular stretch of frozen road held something he needed, even if he couldn't have said what. What he found was a girl with tired eyes and a satchel that clearly held very little, who looked at a filthy, half-frozen stranger and saw not a threat, not a beggar to be turned away, but a child who was hungry. She did not ask what he was. She did not flinch from the wound on his wrist, though it had come from claws no ordinary animal possessed. She simply fed him and warmed his hands between hers for a moment before the cold forced them both to let go, and told him, without ever intending it as anything more than comfort, that he was safe. It was the first time in 4 years anyone had told him that. He carried the words through the rest of that winter, through the pack war that followed, through the long and brutal climb from hunted child to warrior to alpha to, eventually, king. Every rank he earned, every territory he claimed, every enemy he defeated, he measured, quietly, privately, in a place he showed no one, against the memory of a girl's hands wrapping a wound, with more gentleness than the world had shown him in years. He searched for her, the way other men might search for treasure. Not constantly. He had a kingdom to hold together, packs to unite, borders to defend, but persistently, in the gaps between duties, sending word through traders and scouts across a dozen territories, a village near the northern fields, a girl who once fed a starving boy in the snow. For 20 years, the search yielded nothing, until a report crossed his desk noting unrest along the northern border, a small settlement resisting the encroachment of a neighboring alpha named Victor, refusing to yield land that sat, inconveniently, on a strategic mountain pass. Kale had intended to send warriors to settle the matter without his presence being required. Instead, for reasons he did not fully examine at the time, he decided to go himself. His advisors questioned the decision, gently at first, then with growing concern, as the king insisted on personally overseeing what should have been a routine matter of border enforcement. "A dozen warriors could settle this without troubling you," one of them pointed out, as Kale made preparations for the journey. "Victor is ambitious, but he is not yet a threat worth your direct attention." "Perhaps," Kale allowed, offering no further explanation, because he did not yet have the words to explain a pull he could not name. Only that something in the report's mention of a stubborn northern settlement, unwilling to yield despite overwhelming pressure, had struck a chord in him he hadn't felt in 20 years of careful, deliberate rule. He told himself, as he rode north through the last hard weeks of winter, that he was simply a thorough king, unwilling to delegate a matter that might, mishandled, spark a wider conflict between packs. It was not until he crested the final ridge above the settlement and looked down at the frozen fields below, the same fields, though he did not yet know it, where a starving boy had once collapsed in the snow, that something in his chest tightened with a recognition he could not explain. He had ridden this road before, not as a king, as a child running for his life, with nothing left in him but the hope that the next house might, unlike all the others, choose kindness over fear. The moment the mark registered, the moment Kale understood exactly whose hand he was looking at, something in the world seemed to slow. Around them, the villagers remained bowed, unaware that the ground beneath the encounter had just shifted entirely. Vera, for her part, only saw a powerful stranger staring at her hand with an intensity that made her want to pull it back and hide it in her sleeve. "Is something wrong?" she asked, more sharply than she intended. Kale did not answer immediately. He was recalculating 20 years of searching against the impossible coincidence of finding what he sought on the very border he'd come to settle by force. His wolf, meanwhile, had no interest in recalculating anything. It simply wanted to close the distance between them and never allow it to open again. An impulse Kale suppressed with the same iron discipline that had kept him alive since childhood. "Your hand," he said finally. "How did you come by that scar?" Vera's guard rose instantly. She had not survived 20 years of trading favors and defending land by answering strange men's questions about her body. "That's not information I give to visitors who haven't told me why they've come." A flicker of something that might, on a different man, have been called amusement crossed Kale's face. "Fair." He inclined his head, not a bow but an acknowledgement. "I am Kale. I lead the Black Wolf Pack, and the territories that answer to it." The murmur that ran through the crowd this time was not alarm, but something closer to disbelief, because everyone present understood exactly what those words meant. The Alpha King had just introduced himself, by name, to a woman who had refused to kneel to him. "Then you already know why I'm here," Vera said, refusing to let the revelation of his identity shake her composure, though her pulse had picked up considerably. "Victor wants this pass. You've come to decide whether to let him take it or to take it yourself." "I've come," Kale said, "to see the situation with my own eyes before I decide anything." It was, in fact, true, though not for the reasons Vera assumed. He had told himself the border dispute justified the journey. He had not told himself that some deeper instinct had steered him toward this particular stretch of frozen road, the same way instinct had steered a starving boy here 20 years before. That night, Kale did not house his warriors in the village's small guest hall as protocol suggested. He walked its perimeter instead, alone, in human form, studying the layout of the settlement, the state of its defenses, the faces of the people who lived within it, and, more than once, the lit window of the house where Vera lived with her aging mother and younger brother. He told himself he was assessing a vulnerable border position. His wolf knew better. Late in the night, unable to settle, he shed his human form beneath the trees at the settlement's edge and ran the perimeter as a wolf instead, black-furred, massive, silent as smoke. It was in this form that he first watched Vera step outside her door to fetch water from the well, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, unaware that the most feared predator in the Northern Territories was watching her from the tree line, with something far gentler than predation in his gaze. She paused at the well, some instinct of her own prickling at the back of her neck, and looked toward the trees. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, her human eyes, uncertain, and his wolf's eyes, pale gray even in this form, unmistakable to anyone who had looked closely enough to remember them. She did not know why the sight of a wolf watching her from the dark did not frighten her the way it should have. She only knew that something about those eyes felt impossibly familiar. Over the following days, Cale did not press his claim, though every instinct urged him to. He had learned, in 20 years of ruling wolves far more volatile than himself, that force applied too early broke things that patience could otherwise mend. He posted no formal demand regarding the mountain pass. He made no move to declare Vera anything to anyone. Instead, he simply made himself present, reviewing the settlement's defenses, meeting with its elders, and finding, more often than seemed strictly necessary, reasons to be wherever Vera happened to be. She noticed, and she was not pleased by it. "You've inspected that fence 3 times this week," she told him on the 4th day, finding him examining the settlement's northern perimeter for what was indeed the 3rd time. "Either you're the most thorough alpha in the territories, or you're not actually here for the fence." "Perhaps I'm simply cautious," Cale said. "Perhaps you're something else entirely," Vera replied, "and I'd rather you tell me what, than have me guess wrong and cause a problem for my village." It was, Cale thought, an entirely reasonable request, and one he could not yet answer honestly, without revealing a truth he wasn't certain she was ready to hear. The answer came, unplanned, 3 nights later. Vera had gone into the forest at dusk to gather the last of the season's medicinal roots before the ground froze too hard to dig, a task she had performed alone every winter of her adult life without incident. This time, however, she was not alone in the forest. A pair of Victor's scouts, testing the settlement's defenses under cover of darkness, found her first. She heard them before she saw them, the snap of a branch too deliberate to be an animal, the low murmur of voices discussing whether the girl gathering roots might make a useful hostage to force the border dispute in their alpha's favor. Vera did not scream. 20 years of guarding her family's land had taught her that screaming rarely helped and often worsened matters. She simply began, very quietly, to move toward the tree line and the settlement beyond it. She did not make it far before a massive black wolf exploded from the undergrowth between her and the 2 scouts, teeth bared, a growl rolling from its chest that seemed to shake the frozen air itself. The scouts, wolves themselves, recognized both the size and the bearing of the animal before them, and understood, with the particular terror reserved for those who have made a grave miscalculation, exactly whose territory they had wandered into. They fled without a fight. The black wolf did not pursue them. It turned instead to Vera, who stood frozen against a tree, her heart hammering, staring at the animal that had just saved her life. It was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur black as pitch, its eyes an unmistakable striking pale gray. Vera had spent her whole life around wolves, in the sense that everyone in the Northern Territories lived in the shadow of the packs. She knew better than to approach one, even one that had just protected her. And yet something in her, the same something that had refused to kneel, the same something that had given a starving boy her last piece of bread 20 years before, moved her forward instead of back. "Thank you," she said softly, and reached out, slowly, to rest her hand against the thick fur of its shoulder. The wolf went utterly still beneath her touch, as though something in the contact had struck it more deeply than any blow it had taken in battle. It turned its head and looked at her, really looked at her, with an expression far too knowing, far too aware, for any ordinary animal. Vera felt, absurdly, as though she were being recognized by something that had waited a very long time to see her again. "I know you," she whispered, though she could not have said why or from where. "Don't I?" The wolf did not answer, because it could not in this form. But it leaned, just slightly, into her hand, and for one unguarded moment, Vera saw something in those pale gray eyes that felt less like an animal's instinct and more like a man's longing. Then it drew back, turned, and vanished into the trees, leaving Vera standing alone in the winter dark, with her pulse racing, and a question she could not yet name lodged somewhere beneath her ribs. Cale found her the next morning waiting for him outside the guest hall, arms crossed, her expression the particular mixture of suspicion and determination that he was beginning to recognize as entirely, uniquely hers. I want the truth, she said, without preamble. Last night, in the forest? That was you, wasn't it? He could have lied. He was skilled enough at diplomacy to construct a denial that would satisfy her for the moment. But looking at her now, in the gray morning light, with the same steady eyes that had once looked at a starving boy without fear, he found he did not want to. Yes, he said, it was me. Why? Because I was afraid something would happen to you, and I couldn't allow that. That's not an answer. That's a deflection dressed up as an answer. Vera's jaw tightened. Why does an alpha king care what happens to a woman he met 4 days ago? Kale was quiet, weighing where to begin. Then, because he had spent 20 years rehearsing this conversation in the privacy of his own mind, without ever expecting to have the chance to speak it aloud, he told her. He told her about the winter that nearly killed his father's pack. About running for 4 years, alone, hunted by wolves who wanted his bloodline extinguished. About a village girl who had given a starving stranger the last of her bread and bound his wounded wrist with a strip of her own shawl and told him, without knowing what he was, that he was safe. He told her about the promise he had made before vanishing into the trees. I'll find you again. And the 20 years he had spent keeping it, quietly, patiently, through every rank and title and battle that had shaped him into the man standing before her now. Vera listened, and felt the ground shift beneath a life she had thought was settled. That was you, she said slowly, unconsciously touching the faint crescent scar on her hand. The boy in the snow. That was you. Yes, you're certain, because there must have been other starving children that winter. Other. You wrapped my hand with a strip of your shawl, Kale said quietly. You told me your family had little food, but you gave me half of what remained anyway. And when I told you my name, you didn't ask what I was, or where I'd come from. You only asked if I was warm enough. He held her gaze. I have never forgotten a single detail of that night, Vera. Not in 20 years. Something in her chest ached at the sound of her own name in his voice, a name he should not have known, and yet said as though he had been saying it for 2 decades in the privacy of his own thoughts. Why does this matter to you so much? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, and was not certain she was ready to hear it confirmed. You're the Alpha King. You could have anything. Why does a debt from 20 years ago matter enough to bring you to my door? Because it isn't a debt, Kale said. Or, it began as one, perhaps, in my mind, when I was young enough to think that was the shape of it. But it isn't gratitude that brought me here, Vera. It's something my wolf recognized the moment I saw the mark on your hand. Something that doesn't fade with 20 years, or with distance, or with becoming a king. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rawer, more careful than she had yet heard from him. You are my mate. Vera fell silent, something in her chest going tight. She had grown up hearing stories about the mate bond, the wolves' belief that fate paired certain souls together, unbreakable, absolute. She had always regarded it as exactly that. A story, useful for romance and legend, irrelevant to a life spent guarding land and family with her own 2 hands. I don't accept things I haven't chosen for myself, she said finally, and there was no cruelty in it, only the hard-won honesty of a woman who had learned that survival depended on trusting no one's word but her own. Not land, not help, and not this. Whatever this is, I'm not asking you to accept anything, Kale said. I'm asking you to know the truth, so that whatever you choose it with clear eyes. Vera studied him in silence. This man who commanded fear across a dozen territories, who had just told her, with more vulnerability than she suspected he'd shown anyone in 20 years, that fate had bound them together since a night in the snow neither of them had chosen. I need time, she said. You'll have it, Kale answered. I've waited 20 years, Vera. I can wait a while longer. She turned to leave, then paused, one hand on the doorframe, something unresolved still sitting heavy in her chest. There's something else, she said, not looking at him. If you'd found me sooner, 5 years ago, 10, would you have said the same things? Or does it only matter now, because I'm the only piece of that winter you managed to recover? The question landed harder than she expected it to, and she watched Kale's composure slip. Not offense, but the particular ache of a man forced to examine a fear he hadn't fully admitted to himself. I've asked myself that, he admitted finally. Whether what I feel for you is real, or whether it's simply the last surviving thread of a childhood I never got to have properly, whether I've built you up into something larger than a person, because you're tangled up with the only kindness I remember from those years. He met her eyes. I don't have a clean answer for you, Vera. What I know is that the feeling didn't stay the same size it was 20 years ago. It grew. The more I learned about who you actually are. Not the girl who fed a hungry boy, but the woman who refused to kneel to a king, who bound a wolf's wound with her bare hands without flinching, who tells me the truth even when it costs her something to say it. If it were only about the boy and the bread, I think it would have faded by now. It didn't. It became something else. Something built on the actual you, not just the memory of you. Vera weighed the honesty of the answer against every reason she had to distrust easy words from powerful men. That's a better answer than I expected, she admitted. I told you, Cale said, the ghost of that rare smile returning. 20 years of preparation. She left him standing in the doorway of the guest hall, but the conversation stayed with her long after, turning over in her mind through the following days like a stone worn smooth by water. Not because it had resolved anything, but because, for the first time since his arrival, she found she believed him. Word of the Alpha King's continued presence at the border settlement did not stay contained for long, and it reached Victor's ears within the week, carried by the very scouts Cale's wolf had chased from the forest. Victor had wanted the mountain pass for its strategic value alone, but the report that the Alpha King himself had taken a personal, prolonged interest in a village woman, enough to walk her perimeter at night in wolf form, enough to remain past any reasonable diplomatic necessity, gave Victor something far more valuable than land: leverage. Victor arrived at the settlement's border 5 days later, not with the modest guard a diplomatic visit warranted, but with a full company of warriors, a deliberate show of force meant to communicate that he considered the pass, and everything on it, already his by right, regardless of who else might be standing in the way. He was, in his own fashion, an impressive man, broad, scarred, carrying himself with the swagger of someone who had never once lost a fight he cared to remember. But where Cale's power radiated as stillness, Victor's radiated as threat, loud and deliberate, the kind that needed an audience to matter. Cale, he said, when the two alphas finally faced each other on the frozen field between their respective warriors. I didn't expect the king himself to trouble over a border dispute this small. And yet here you are, with considerably more warriors than a border dispute this small requires. Cale replied evenly. Careful, Victor. A man might mistake your presence for something more than diplomacy. Victor's gaze slid past Cale to where Vera stood at the edge of the gathered villagers, watching the exchange with the wary stillness of someone who understood, with growing dread, that she had somehow become the fulcrum of a conflict between two of the most powerful men in the Northern Territories. I hear the village elder's daughter has caught the king's attention, Victor said, loud enough to carry. How fortunate for her. Perhaps fortunate enough that she'd consider a wiser arrangement, one that doesn't leave her village standing between two alphas who both want the same thing. Watch your tone, Cale said, and something in his voice dropped several degrees, quiet enough that only those closest could hear the danger folded into it. Or what? Victor's smile did not waver, though something calculating sharpened behind his eyes. He had come seeking exactly this reaction, and he had found it. You'll fight me over territory you haven't even formally claimed? Careful, Cale. A man might mistake that for something more than diplomacy, too. Cale said nothing, which told Victor everything he needed to know. That night, after Victor's company had retreated to make camp beyond the settlement's border, Vera found Cale standing alone at the edge of the frozen field, his expression unreadable in the dark. He'll use this, she said, coming to stand beside him. Whatever is happening between us, he'll use it as a reason to take the pass, or worse, to come after me directly to hurt you. I know. Then perhaps it would be safer, Vera said carefully, if you left. If there was nothing here for Victor to use. Cale turned to look at her, and there was something fierce beneath the stillness of his expression now. I spent 20 years searching for you, Vera. I am not leaving you undefended because a man like Victor decided to make a threat of it. I don't need you to defend me, Vera said, old instincts flaring. I've protected this village and my family for years without an Alpha King standing over my shoulder. I don't doubt that, Cale said, and something in his tone gentled, though it lost none of its conviction. You've survived 20 years without me, and you'd survive 20 more. But surviving and being safe from a man who's already shown he's willing to use you as a weapon are not the same thing. Let me stay, not because you need saving, because I refuse to lose you a second time, when I finally have the chance not to. Vera hesitated, torn between the fierce independence that had carried her through every hardship of her adult life, and something new and unfamiliar stirring beneath it. A willingness, however reluctant, to let someone stand beside her instead of only ever standing alone. Fine, she said finally, stay, but not as my protector. As whatever else this is turning out to be. Something in Kale's expression eased for the first time since Victor's arrival. I can accept those terms. In the days that followed, Victor did not withdraw, but neither did he escalate. Content, it seemed, to let the tension he had planted take root on its own. His warriors made camp just beyond the settlement's border, a visible reminder of the threat that hung over the mountain pass, while Victor himself rode out twice more, always finding some pretext to speak with Vera directly, always careful to frame his attention as concern for a woman caught between powerful men, rather than what it truly was, a calculated attempt to widen the crack he believed he'd found. You don't have to choose the king simply because he found you first, Victor told her once, catching her alone at the edge of the market where the village traded what little surplus the winter allowed. A woman with your composure could do a great deal better than a man who'll use you as a symbol the moment it suits his politics. And you wouldn't? Vera asked, unimpressed. Victor smiled, unbothered by the accusation. I'd at least be honest about it. You've mistaken honesty for arrogance, Vera said, and walked away before he could offer a reply, though the exchange lingered with her longer than she wanted to admit. Not because Victor's words held any truth, but because they sharpened a fear she had been carrying quietly since Kale's confession, that whatever grew between them would always, in some sense, belong to the Pax before it belonged to either of them. She raised the fear with Kale that evening, as they walked the frozen bank of the river together, a habit that had become, without either of them naming it, the closest thing to courtship the winter allowed. Victor says I'll only ever be a symbol to you, she said. That whatever this becomes will be shaped by what the Pax need to see, not by what either of us actually wants. Kale was quiet for a moment, watching the dark water move sluggishly beneath a skin of ice. Victor says a great many things designed to unsettle you, because unsettling you serves him better than the truth does. He turned to face her fully, but I won't pretend the fear is groundless. I am a king, Vera. Everything I do is watched, weighed, and used by someone. That won't change if you choose me. If anything, it will become more true, not less. That's not exactly reassuring. No, he agreed, but I'd rather give you the truth of it than a comfort that wouldn't survive the first hard winter. What I can promise you is this. Whatever the Pax see, whatever they read into it, the choosing itself will always be yours. I will never make you a symbol in private, whatever you become in public. That much I can control. Vera considered this, turning it over the way she turned over every decision that mattered, slowly, without rushing toward comfort, simply because comfort was easier. That's a fair answer, she said finally. Better than I expected. They walked in silence for a while after that, the only sound the crunch of frost beneath their boots and the distant call of some night birds settling into the trees. Vera found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mind the silence, that she had spent so much of her life filling every space with vigilance, with the constant, exhausting work of anticipating the next threat to her family's land, that simply walking beside someone, without needing to guard against him, felt like a kind of rest she hadn't realized she was starving for. Tell me something true, she said eventually, breaking the quiet. Not about the Pax, or the politics, or any of it. Something only you would know. Kale considered this for a moment. When I was young, before the running, before any of it, my mother used to say that a wolf's howl carried the truest part of him, because it was the one sound he couldn't shape into a lie. I didn't understand what she meant until years later, alone in the forest, howling out of grief for a family I'd lost, and realizing the sound coming out of me was raw in a way nothing else about me was allowed to be. I still think of that, sometimes, that the howl is the one thing even a king can't perform. Vera looked at him, something in her chest loosening at the unguarded honesty of it. Not a king's confession, carefully weighed for its political cost, but simply a man's. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me something true. I've had 20 years to think about what I'd say if I ever found you again," Kale said, with the faintest trace of dry humor beneath the earnestness. "I'd hate to waste the preparation." Despite herself, Vera laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the first she'd allowed herself since his arrival, and something in Kale's chest eased at the sound of it, as though he'd been holding his breath for weeks without realizing it. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between them, slow and quiet as snowmelt. Kale did not press his claim, and Vera did not withdraw hers, and in the space between those two restraints, something gentler than either of them expected began to grow. He walked with her to the river when she went to check the ice. She began, without quite noticing when it started, to save him a portion of whatever she cooked. The same instinct that had once made her share her bread now turned toward something less desperate and more deliberate. He told her, in pieces, about the years between the boy in the snow and the king he'd become, the battles, the losses, the packs he'd united, not through cruelty, but through the simple, exhausting persistence of proving himself trustworthy again and again. She told him, in pieces, about her father's death, about the years spent holding her family's land together through sheer stubbornness, about the walls she had built because leaning on anyone had only ever taught her how much further she had left to fall when they inevitably let her down. Neither of them called it courtship. Both of them understood, without needing to say so, that it was. The turning point came on the night of the full moon. Vera had never witnessed a true transformation up close. Most werewolves conducted the change privately, away from human eyes, out of both instinct and courtesy. But that night, restless and unable to sleep, she wandered to the edge of the settlement and found Kale alone beneath the bare winter trees, moonlight falling full and silver across the clearing, his expression tense with the particular discipline of a man about to surrender control of his own body to something older than himself. "You should go back inside," he said without turning. "This isn't something meant to be watched." "I'm not afraid," Vera said, and meant it. He turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight, his pale gray eyes seemed almost luminous. "It isn't about fear, it's about, this form isn't gentle, Vera. Even for those who love the man wearing it. I already met your wolf," she reminded him softly. "In the forest. He didn't frighten me then, either." Kale hesitated, weighing 20 years of careful restraint against the simple fact that she was asking to stay, and found, in the end, that he did not have it in him to send her away. "Stay then," he said quietly, "if you wish." The change, when it came, was neither gentle nor easy. A wrenching, powerful thing that spoke of bone and sinew rearranging themselves under the moon's pull. Vera did not look away. She watched with the same steady, unflinching attention she brought to everything else in her life, and when the transformation finished, and the massive black wolf stood before her once more, she did not hesitate before crossing the clearing to press her hand against his fur, exactly as she had the first time. "I know you," she said again, and this time she said it not as a question but as a certainty. "I've known you since I was a girl feeding a stranger in the snow, even if I didn't understand it until now." The wolf pressed its head against her hand, and in the silver moonlight, Vera felt something settle inside her chest that she had spent 20 years refusing to let anyone reach. When Kale returned to his human form near dawn, wrapped in the fur cloak she'd brought for him, he found her waiting, unshaken, watching the horizon lighten over the mountains. "I never stopped looking for you," he said quietly, the words finally spoken plainly, without the armor of explanation he'd wrapped them in before. "Not once, in 20 years. Every territory I claimed, every peace I brokered, some part of me was still that boy in the snow, hoping it might lead me back to the girl who fed him." Vera turned to look at him, and for the first time since his arrival, she let him see, without guarding it, exactly what she felt. "I think," she said slowly, "that some part of me has been waiting for you too. I just didn't know it until you were standing in front of me." He reached for her hand then, the one bearing the faint crescent scar, and pressed his lips to it, gentle as the wrapping she'd once given him, 20 years and a lifetime ago. "Then let me stay," he said. "Not as your king, as the boy who never forgot you. Stay," Vera whispered, and meant it with everything she had left to give. They did not speak of what the moment meant. Not that night. Some understandings, Vera thought, were better left to settle quietly, rather than be named too soon, and asked to bear more weight than they were ready for. But something had shifted permanently in the days that followed. Kale no longer found reasons to be near her. He simply was near her, and she no longer pretended not to notice, or not to want it. He taught her, one gray afternoon, the meaning behind the old pack customs she had only ever heard spoken of in passing, the significance of a shared meal prepared by one's own hand rather than a servant's, the old belief that a mate bond, once acknowledged by both wolves, wove itself into the land a pack called home, strengthening it in ways no border wall or army ever could. Vera, in turn, taught him things no king's education had ever covered: how to read the coming weather in the color of the mountain's shadow at dusk, how to set a snare that wouldn't alert the whole forest, the particular stubbornness required to coax a stove fire back to life with damp wood on a night too cold to fetch more. "You'd have made a fine warrior," Kale told her once, watching her coax flame from kindling that should not, by any reasonable measure, have caught. "I'd have made a fine anything I set my mind to," Vera said, without false modesty. "That's rather the point of me." "I'm aware," Kale said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it told her, more clearly than any declaration could have, exactly how much he meant it. There were harder moments, too. Nights when Vera woke from dreams of the wolves that had hunted Kale through his childhood forest, feeling a grief that wasn't quite her own but had become, somehow, something she carried alongside him. Days when the weight of what accepting him might cost her, the loss of the quiet, self-governed life she'd spent 20 years building, pressed against her resolve, until she wondered whether she was strong enough to become someone's queen, without losing the woman who had never needed anyone's permission to survive. She confided this fear to him plainly, because she had decided, somewhere in these weeks, that whatever else changed between them, she would not build this on the same silences that had protected her for so long. "I'm afraid of disappearing into what you need me to be," she admitted, one evening as they sat by the low fire in her family's home, her mother and brother long since retired for the night. "I've spent so long being only myself. I don't know how to be anyone's queen without losing that." Kale reached for her hand, turning it gently to trace the faint crescent scar with his thumb, the same gesture he found himself returning to whenever he needed to remember that this was real, that she was real, that 20 years of searching had not been in vain. "Then don't be my queen," he said. "Be Vera, who happens to stand beside a king. I didn't fall in love with a title you might wear someday. I fell in love with a girl who gave a stranger her last piece of bread because it was right, not because it was easy. If becoming my queen ever asks you to stop being her, then I've asked the wrong thing of you, and you should refuse me." "You say that so easily. I've had 20 years to mean it," Kale said. "It isn't easy. It's simply certain." Vera looked at him for a long moment, feeling the last of her guarded resistance settle into something quieter, something closer to trust than she had allowed herself in a very long time. Victor had not been idle during the weeks Kale and Vera spent building something neither of them had expected to find. Quietly, patiently, he had been courting the loyalty of warriors within Kale's own ranks, men who resented the king's growing preoccupation with a border village, and a woman with no pack lineage to speak of. Men who believed a king distracted by matters of the heart was a king ripe for replacement. Victor promised them territory, rank, freedom from the increasingly strict codes Kale had imposed to keep the peace between packs. It did not take much convincing. Ambition, Victor had learned long ago, required only the smallest crack to widen into betrayal. The attack came at dusk, timed for the day Kale's warriors had thinned their numbers to escort a trade caravan through the pass, leaving the settlement more vulnerable than it had been in weeks. Vera was taken from the well where she'd gone to fetch water, seized by 2 of Victor's men before she could so much as call for help, a cloth pressed over her mouth before her cry could carry. When Kale returned from the caravan escort to find the settlement in chaos and Vera missing, something in him went cold and still, in a way that had not happened since the worst years of his childhood running. "She's not here," Vera's younger brother said, breathless with panic. "They took her. I saw them. Near the well. 3 of them. And one of them was wearing Victor's colors." Kale did not wait to hear the rest. He shed his human form in the space of a single breath and was gone into the trees before anyone could stop him, tracking a scent that had become, over the past weeks, as familiar to his wolf as his own. He found the trail leading not toward Victor's territory, as expected, but to a hidden camp deep within the contested pass itself. Victor's true intention finally revealed. He did not want the mountain pass for its strategic value alone. He wanted it as the staging ground for something far larger, a direct challenge to Kale's rule, using Vera as both hostage and provocation, forcing the Alpha King into a confrontation he could frame, to the watching packs, as Kale abandoning diplomacy for personal vengeance. Proof, Victor would claim, that the king had grown too soft, too distracted, too unfit to hold the crown he wore. Inside the camp, Vera had not made this easy for her captors. Bound but far from broken, she had spent the hours since her capture memorizing every detail of the camp's defenses, counting warriors, noting weaknesses in the perimeter, with the same steady, methodical attention she brought to protecting her own land. "You won't get what you want from this," she told Victor, when he finally came to see his captured leverage for himself. "Kale isn't the kind of man who trades his kingdom for a hostage." "No?" Victor agreed, crouching to study her with the appraising look of a man assessing a valuable acquisition. "But he is the kind of man who'll come for you regardless of the cost, which suits my purposes just as well. A king who abandons strategy for sentiment is a king the packs will stop trusting to lead them. You're not a hostage, girl. You're a demonstration." "Then you don't understand him at all," Vera said, with more certainty than her circumstances warranted. "He's spent 20 years learning exactly how to be strong and gentle at once. You're betting your whole plan on the idea that those two things can't exist in the same man. You're wrong." Doubt crossed Victor's face, faint, but real enough that Vera filed the reaction away. Another small piece of information to use when the moment came. Outside the camp, in the tree line, Kale had already begun assessing the same weaknesses Vera had catalogued from within, a testament, though he did not yet know it, to how alike their instincts truly were. He did not charge in blindly, however desperately his wolf urged him to. 20 years of leading packs through conflict had taught him that rage untempered by strategy was the surest way to lose everything he meant to protect. He sent word back to the settlement instead, calling for the warriors returning from the caravan escort, and began, in the falling dark, to plan not a rescue born of desperation, but a war born of precision. Because Victor had made a grave miscalculation in believing that loving someone made a king weaker. He was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. In the hours before the assault, Kale allowed himself one moment of stillness, kneeling in the frost at the edge of the tree line, eyes closed, gathering the discipline that had carried him through every crisis of his life, since the winter he'd nearly died in the snow. He thought of Vera as she'd looked the night of the full moon, unafraid, her hands steady against his fur. He thought of the promise he had made her, that whatever the packs saw, the choosing between them would always remain their own. He intended to keep that promise even now, with her life balanced against a rival's ambition, because the alternative was to become exactly the kind of king Victor had gambled he would become, reckless, ruled by fear instead of purpose. "We take the camp's perimeter first," he told the warriors gathered around him, his voice low and even, despite the storm behind his eyes. "No one moves on the center until the outer guard is neutralized. I will not risk her by rushing this." His second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Bram, who had served the pack since before Kale's coronation, studied his king a beat before answering. "You could go in alone, faster. Your wolf against a handful of guards would end quickly, and if I'm wrong about how many guards remain, or where they've kept her, I lose the only chance I have to do this without losing her in the chaos," Kale said. "I've waited 20 years to find her, Bram. I can endure the hour it takes to do this properly." It was, in the end, exactly the kind of restraint that had made him a king worth following, rather than merely a king worth fearing. And it was that same restraint, patient and deliberate even in the face of everything he stood to lose, that gave his warriors the confidence to follow him into a fight none of them had chosen, against a rival who still believed love had made their king weak instead of immovable. By the time Kale's warriors regrouped at the edge of the contested pass, word of Vera's capture had spread through every settlement loyal to the Black Wolf Pack, and warriors who had sworn fealty to Kale's rule arrived from territories Victor had not anticipated needing to defend against. Victor had believed the coup would fracture Kale's support. Instead, it hardened it. Pacts that had remained neutral through years of careful diplomacy chose, in the span of a single night, to stand with a king who had proven, through every measured, patient month of his courtship, through every restrained response to Victor's provocations, that his strength had never once required cruelty to sustain it. Inside the camp, Vera had not wasted the hours of her captivity. She had worked the ropes at her wrists loose enough to slip, watching for the moment Victor's attention would be divided enough to give her an opening. That moment came at midnight, when scouts burst into the camp, reporting the approach of Kale's assembled forces, far larger, far more unified, than Victor's intelligence had promised him. In the chaos of warriors scrambling to positions, Vera slipped free of her bonds and moved, quiet and quick, toward the section of the camp where she had noted, days ago in her methodical assessment, that the guard rotation left a gap wide enough to pass through unseen. She did not run blindly into the dark. She ran toward the sound of a wolf's howl she would have recognized anywhere in the world, low, resonant, carrying a note of fury and desperation that told her Kale already knew she was missing from wherever they'd kept her, and was tearing the camp apart to find her. She found him at the camp's edge, mid-transformation, warriors clashing around him in the confused violence of a battle that had begun before either side was fully prepared for it. When his eyes found her, human still, blood on her wrists from the ropes but otherwise unharmed, something in his expression broke open with a relief so raw it was almost painful to witness. "Vera, I'm here," she said, closing the distance between them despite the chaos, despite every instinct that should have sent her running for safety instead. "I'm here, and I'm not hurt, and I need you to listen to me. Victor's plan isn't the pass. It's your crown. He wants you to lose control here, in front of everyone, so the pack stop trusting your judgment." Kale's jaw tightened, but he held himself steady, absorbing the information with the same discipline that had carried him through 20 years of careful rule. "Then I won't give him that." He did not, in the end, fight Victor with rage. He fought him with the same measured precision he had brought to every conflict since he'd first clawed his way up from a starving, hunted child to a king capable of holding a fractious collection of packs together through sheer force of earned trust. When the two alphas finally met in the center of the chaos, Victor in wolf form, massive and furious at watching his careful plan unravel, Kale transformed at last, black-furred and controlled even in the height of battle. The fight that followed was brutal, but it was not blind. Vera, from the tree line where Kale had ordered her to safety before the final clash, watched the two wolves circle and strike with a fear she did not try to hide, because pretending otherwise would have been a lie, and she had promised herself, somewhere in the past weeks, that she would not lie to herself about how much this man had come to matter. The fight ended not with Victor's death, but with his surrender, pinned, defeated, exposed before the very warriors he'd convinced to betray their king, who now watched their former ally beaten by the man he'd claimed was too soft to hold his own crown. Kale did not kill him. It would have been the expected outcome, the outcome Victor himself might have chosen in his place. Instead, standing over his defeated rival in his human form once more, breathing hard, Vera's safety finally secured behind him, Kale made a different choice. "You wanted proof I'd trade my kingdom for sentiment," he said, loud enough for every gathered warrior to hear. "Here is your proof, Victor. I came for her because I choose to. And I beat you, because choosing her never once meant abandoning what I owe to every pack that trusts me to lead them well. Those two things were never in conflict. You simply never understood a king who could hold both." The warriors who had followed Victor into betrayal knelt, one by one, before the king they had underestimated. Vera, watching from the tree line, felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Victor himself was stripped of rank and territory in the days that followed, exiled beyond the borders of every pack that answered to Kale's rule. Not killed, not made a martyr for whatever resentment still lingered among the ambitious, but simply removed, quietly and completely, from any position where his hunger for power could again endanger the peace so many warriors had bled to protect. It was, Vera thought when she heard the judgment delivered, Exactly the kind of mercy that revealed more strength than cruelty ever could have. A crueler king would have made an example of him. Kale, instead, made a lesson of restraint. Proof, delivered without a single wasted word, that his authority had never depended on fear alone. Bram, standing beside Vera as the warriors dispersed to tend their wounded and begin the long walk home, allowed himself a rare, small smile. 20 years I've served him, he said, and I've never once seen him fight the way he fought tonight. Controlled, patient. Even furious, he never lost the thread of what mattered. He glanced at Vera. I think you should know that, whatever the histories say of him afterward, that patience is yours. He learned to hold his rage like that because he had you to come back to. Before, he simply had the fight. Vera said nothing, but the words settled somewhere deep and warm inside her, a truth she would carry long after that night, long after the frost finally broke and spring returned to the mountain pass. Peace returned to the northern territories in the weeks that followed, settling over the mountain pass and its surrounding settlements like the first true thaw of spring. Victor's remaining allies, stripped of the leverage his failed coup had promised them, submitted to Kale's authority without further resistance, and the packs that had rallied to defend their king in his hour of need found their loyalty rewarded not with punishment for their neutrality, but with the same measured fairness Kale had always governed by. Vera returned to her village to find it changed in ways both large and small, her family's land no longer contested, her people no longer living in the shadow of a border dispute that had threatened to consume them, and herself, most of all, no longer the same guarded woman who had refused to kneel on a frozen morning weeks before. Kale found her by the well, exactly where she had been standing when Victor's men had taken her, a location she had returned to deliberately, she admitted later, as a way of reclaiming something that had been stolen from her. The packs will expect an answer soon, he said, standing beside her in the pale winter sunlight. Whether the woman who stood beside their king through a war will stand beside him as more than that. Is that a proposal? Vera asked, arching an eyebrow. Or a political briefing? The corner of Kale's mouth lifted, a rare, unguarded smile that she had come, over the past weeks, to treasure precisely because it was rare. Both, if you'll allow it to be. But only because I want it to be, Vera. Not because the packs require it. And not because a debt from 20 years ago demands repayment. I want you to be my Luna, my equal. Not because fate decided it in a snowy forest before either of us understood what that meant, but because I have spent every day since then choosing you, and I intend to spend every day after this one doing exactly the same. Vera turned to face him fully, the mountain wind catching loose strands of her hair, the faint crescent scar on her hand visible between them. The mark that had once meant a debt, and now meant something far larger than either of them could have imagined on the night it was made. I searched for you for 20 years, Kale said quietly, echoing words he had carried since childhood, finally spoken to the person they had always been meant for. And if I had never found you, then you would have searched for 20 more. Vera finished softly, because she had come to know this man well enough, in these short weeks, to know exactly the shape of his devotion. Yes, Kale said. Exactly that. Vera looked down at the scar on her hand, the mark of a kindness given without expectation of return, that had, against every reasonable measure of probability, found its way back to her 20 years and a lifetime later, carried by a boy who had grown into a king and never once stopped searching. Then let it be my choice, she said, and reached for his hand, the same hand that had once, as a starving child's, been wrapped in a strip of her shawl. Not fate's, not the pack's, mine. I choose you, Kale. Not because you're the Alpha King, and not because a wolf decided it before I had a say. Because you waited. Because you were patient when patience cost you nothing but time, and honest when honesty risked losing me entirely. Because somewhere in these past weeks, without either of us planning it, I stopped guarding myself against you. Kale closed his hand around hers, and in the winter sunlight, the mark on her hand, the mark that had brought a king back across 20 years and 100 battles, caught the light between them like something sacred. Then, be my Luna, he said, not because you must, because you choose to. I choose to, Vera said, and meant it with everything the years had built in her, every wall she had carefully constructed, and, for this man alone, chosen to let fall. They were married in the settlement where it had all begun, beneath the same trees where a starving boy had once vanished into the dark with a whispered promise, surrounded by villagers who had once bowed their heads to a king and now bowed them, with far greater warmth, to a queen who had earned her crown not through birth or bloodline, but through 20 years of quiet, unwavering kindness that had finally, impossibly, found its way home. In the seasons that followed, the settlement where it had all begun grew from a contested border village into something closer to a second capital, not because Kale commanded it, but because word spread, pack to pack and village to village, of a king and queen who had built their bond not on conquest or convenience, but on a debt of kindness repaid 20 years after it was given. Traders who had once avoided the northern pass for fear of victors' ambitions now traveled it freely, and the mountain settlement that had spent a generation defending its borders alone found itself, for the first time, genuinely safe. Vera did not abandon the life she had built before Kale's return, though it changed shape around her new title. She continued to set broken bones and negotiate fair trades, though now the villagers who came to her for help called her Luna as often as they called her by name, a title she wore, in the end, with the same steady practicality she had once worn her old life, not as a costume, but as one more responsibility she intended to carry well. Kale, for his part, spent less time behind the walls of the Black Wolf Pack's stronghold than any king before him, choosing instead to divide his rule between the demands of the wider territories and the quiet, unremarkable joys of a life he had once believed impossible for a hunted, starving child to ever claim. A home with a fire that stayed lit, a table that never went empty, and a woman beside him who had chosen him freely, again and again, long after any debt between them had been settled in full. On the anniversary of the night they first met, a night neither of them had marked for 20 years, because neither had known the other survived to remember it, Kale brought Vera back to the exact spot along the forest path where a starving boy had once collapsed in the snow. The frost had long since thawed into the soft green of early spring, and where a desperate child had once begged for food, a king now knelt instead to place a single, carefully wrapped loaf of bread at the base of an old tree, a private ritual meant for no one's eyes but their own. "Why here?" Vera asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because everything I became from this exact place," Kale said. "I wanted to remember it properly for once, instead of only surviving it, and I wanted you beside me when I did." Vera knelt beside him, resting her fingers against the mark on her own hand, the scar that had carried her, unknowingly, toward a life she could never have imagined for herself, on the night she'd first bound a stranger's wound. "We were children who didn't know what we were building," she said softly. "A piece of bread, a strip of cloth. Neither of us thought it would matter beyond that single night. And yet here we are," Kale said, 20 years later, because it mattered more than either of us understood. The Northern Territories remembered, in the years that followed, that their king had once been a starving child, saved by a girl who asked for nothing in return, and that the greatest kingdoms, in the end, were built not on conquest, but on the simple, radical act of choosing to feed a stranger in the snow. Thank you for spending this story with us here at Rena Romance 2. If Vera and Kale's journey moved you the way it moved us, let us know in the comments, give this video a like, and subscribe so you're here for the next slow burn romance we bring to life. Until then, stay warm, and we'll see you in the next story.